Today is Unboxing Day. The 2022 Women's Quarters program, Wilma Mankiller Quarter, was released last Tuesday. Today's Friday, and it just arrived in the mail. So we're going to open this up and look into Wilma Mankiller. Wilma Pearl Mankiller was the first woman to be elected chief of the Cherokee Nation in 1985, and she served for 10 years until 1995. Before we get into who she was and what her accomplishments were, we need to discuss something known as the Trail of Tears. And it's important, A, because we're talking about Native Americans, and I don't think that enough people understand or know even what the Trail of Tears was. But it's also important because it comes into play when we're talking about some of the things that she went through and that she did in her life. In the 1930s, in the southeastern United States, there were essentially five what they called civilized tribes: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and the Cherokee. And by civilized, I mean these were tribes that decided they were going to try to live by European standards. They were going to sort of, while they maintained their own property and land, they were going to sort of fit in with the community, so to speak. They learned to speak English. They adopted European economic principles such as land ownership and property ownership. They tried to get along with their neighbors. The problem was, in the early 1930s, that people, Southern farmer, plantation owners, landowners, Southern governments realized that these Native American tribes were sitting on valuable land and decided that they wanted that land because of their need to expand their cotton growth and plantations. And so they started harassing the tribes and trying to force these Native American tribes that were trying to assimilate and get along, try to force them off of their property. In 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court said, wait a minute, you can't do that. They are sovereign nations. They have a right to their property. They have a right to their land. It's theirs. Leave them alone, basically. Problem with that is, at the time, Andrew Jackson was the president. And Andrew Jackson essentially said, if the Supreme Court makes a decision, makes a ruling, but nobody enforces it, does it matter that they said it? And completely ignored the ruling handed down by the Supreme Court. And they started forcing the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek off of their land to take it. And by forcing, I mean sending troops in to put them in shackles and march them from their lands all the way to essentially Oklahoma, to west of the Mississippi, to some place where they would just be out of the way and forgotten about. So the last remaining tribe, basically the Cherokee, held out for as long as they could, tried to negotiate, tried to do other things. It fell through. Finally, in the late 1930s, now Martin Van Buren is the president, and he just sent the troops down and forced the Cherokee off the land and sent them into what was Oklahoma, or what became Oklahoma. It was nothing at the time. It was just barren land. And they said, here, we're going to trade you your land here for all this land west of the Mississippi, and it's all yours, and go have it. And so in the process of marching all of these tribes to Cherokee land, they died of dysentery. People died of dysentery, starvation. They were treated cruelly. Basically, the people marching them didn't care about them. And this became known as the Trail of Tears. So now we're in Oklahoma, or what will become Oklahoma. We're in Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi, and settlers started moving in. And suddenly, all of their vast land kept shrinking and shrinking, and then Oklahoma became a state, and all of their land was gone, and they were basically reduced to a corner of the state of Oklahoma. And so I just wanted to mention the Trail of Tears because it's important when we're discussing Wilma Mankiller and her life. So she was born in Cherokee Nation in 1945, and I just have to say, I think that Mankiller, when I first saw her name, I thought that was such a cool, like, just so Native American. That was such a cool name, and I had to look into it. And apparently, Mankiller is a military rank among the Cherokee. It's like a colonel, lieutenant, whatever. But Mankiller was a military rank, and I just think that's a super cool name. So yeah, she was born in the Cherokee Nation in 1945. The date I have on here is wrong, and I just realized it. Her family was moved to public housing in San Francisco in 1955. Due to they were forced to move basically because there was a horrible drought going on where her family lived. And she even said at some point in her life, she made the comment that she never realized that they were poor when she was growing up in Cherokee Nation. Even though they didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing or any of those things, she never realized they were poor until they were moved away from Cherokee Nation and moved to San Francisco. While she was in San Francisco, growing up, she sort of in her late teens, early 20s, started to become more of an activist for Native American issues. There was a sit-in that I guess lasted 19 months in Alcatraz. They were trying to reclaim Alcatraz as native lands because it was no longer in use. And so she participated in things like that. In 1977, she returned to Cherokee Nation and she founded the Community Development Department, the Community Development Department for the Cherokee Nation. She led the creation of community water systems and rehabilitation of houses during the administration of the Principal Chief Ross Swimmer. So it occurred to me going through this in the 1950s, she's living in the United States. Essentially, I mean, she's living in the Cherokee Nation, but she's living in the United States growing up in the 1950s with no electricity and no running water, no indoor plumbing. I was sort of shocked when I heard that fact, just because I knew the conditions. From what I've heard, I don't know. I've never visited any kind of Indian land, anything like that. But I knew that conditions in the Indian lands were not good. But to learn that as recently as 1955 there was no indoor plumbing or electricity, that sort of shocked me. So, as an activist or activistly minded, I realize that's not a word, but I just made it up. She went back to her people and wanted to do something. So she decided that she was going to better their living conditions. She was going to get them better housing, probably, I'm going to assume, with things like electricity and indoor plumbing. And she was sort of taken on by Principal Chief Ross Swimmer to be, when he was up for re-election, to be his running mate. So they won. And then when he decided to, after his term was up, he was going to become the head of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So Wilma Mankiller decided to run, and she was elected chief in, this says 1987. My other information said 1985. So somewhere between 1987 and 1985, or 85 and 87, she became the first female elected chief of the Cherokee Nation, and she was reelected in a landslide 4 years later. During her time as chief, she tripled her tribe's enrollment, doubled employment, and built new housing, health centers, and children's programs in Northeast Oklahoma. Under her leadership, infant mortality declined and educational levels rose. Her leadership on social and financial issues made her tribe a national role model. As an aside, I pulled this quote that I just find this insulting and in an ironic insulting way, almost humorous, not to be insulting to them, but just a significant number of people believe tribal people still live and dress as they did 300 years ago. During my tenure as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, national news agencies requested interviews, sometimes asked if they could film a tribal dance or if I would wear traditional tribal clothing for the interview. I doubt they asked the President of the United States to dress like a pilgrim for an interview. Funny in an ironic, sort of insulting way. That this is the 1980s when she was the principal chief, late 80s, early 90s, and people still wanted her to dress to play cowboys and Indians. I just think that to her that's completely disrespectful and insulting to her and any tribal people anywhere that journalists, that national news agencies, people that have college educations that are supposed to be intelligent would ask these questions. I guess I keep talking about it because it blows me away that took place. In 1998, Wilma Mankiller received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor given to civilians in the United States. And then she died April 6, 2010, at the age of 65 from pancreatic cancer. One of the things that she is attributed was saying, one of her quotes is that I've run into more discrimination as a woman than as an Indian. At her funeral, President Barack Obama attended her funeral, and he was quoted as saying, as the Cherokee Nation's first female chief, she transformed the nation-to-nation relationship between the Cherokee Nation and the federal government and served as an inspiration to women in Indian country and across America. A recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, she was recognized for her vision and commitment to a brighter future for all Americans. Her legacy will continue to encourage and motivate all who carry on her work. So, the reason I wanted to reference the Trail of Tears was the reference that President Obama made to her helping to repair the relationship between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation. And something I forgot to mention earlier, when she was 11, and her family was moved from San Francisco, or from Cherokee Nation to San Francisco, she often referred to that as her own little Trail of Tears, because they were sort of uprooted, put someplace that they didn't know, from Indian land to the middle of a city where she was picked on, she was bullied, she was made to feel inadequate. It caused her, for a lot of her life, to hate school. And so I just think it's important that we know that it wasn't easy for her growing up as a Native American on non-Native American land. And then once again, referring back to the other quarters that we looked at, her quote, prior to my election, young Cherokee girls would never have thought that they might grow up and become chief. And once again, that is important also, because as we're talking about these quarters and we're talking about why it's important for this Women's Quarters program, we have to address the fact that when you see somebody that looks like you achieve things in life, that leads to the belief that, hey, maybe I can achieve those things. And those are important. I will say this till the day I die. It's important for people of all backgrounds, of all walks of life, of all races, creeds, nationalities, religions, everything, to have people that look like them achieve things so they feel like they might have a chance to achieve those things themselves. It's so important. And that's, I think, where I want to leave it for the introduction to Wilma Mankiller. Now let's jump into, let me find my knife. We're going to jump into the box and we're going to see what the Wilma Mankiller quarter looks like. I saved myself the embarrassment of struggling with the box because they've gone back to the boxes that I have difficulty opening, especially on camera. So I cut through the middleman, got the box open, haven't opened up any of the quarter rolls or anything like that. So that's where we are. Let me grab the Philadelphia, set these aside. Take out the knife. Let's see if we can't carefully get into this. I know it's blurry. I'll fix it in 2 seconds. Let me get a closer view here. All right, this is, once again, on a coin. The head side is referred to as the obverse, and it, of course, depicts the portrait of George Washington, and this is the original composition by Laura Gardine Fraser, and it marked George Washington's 200th birthday, and it was designed in 1932, but this design was passed on for the design that we basically all grew up recognizing on the Washington Quarter. And by different, the head is a little bit different, but so is the bust is a little bit different, but it's also facing a different direction. And then on the reversed side, let's see if we can get this. The reverse of this coin depicts Wilma Mankiller with a resolute gaze to the future, the wind at her back, and she's wrapped in a traditional shawl. And to her left is the 7-pointed star of the Cherokee Nation. And you will also see in Cherokee, I don't want to say language or alphabet, it's syllabary. It says Cherokee Nation in, you can see it, I blew it up a little bit. The sort of unfamiliar characters there says Cherokee Nation in the Cherokee syllabary. And so I just think that this is, it's a cool, of course, I think all coins are cool. But, and I feel like all coins, I'm going to say it again, I'm going to say it every time I make a video about coins, all coins have a history lesson in them. And without the American Women's Quarters program and without the Wilma Mankiller coin being released, I wouldn't know anything about who she was or the contributions that she made to both the Cherokee people and to the United States. And so I want to thank the U.S. Mint for releasing this coin. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, or criticisms, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And as always, the first 10 or so people that email me at the email address down below and ask, I will send them a Philadelphia Mint Wilma Mankiller quarter. All you need to do is email me. And when you email me, give me your mailing address or someplace that you'd like me to send the quarter. And the first 10 or so people that request it, I will send them a Wilma Mankiller Philadelphia Mint 2022 quarter. Anyhow, I hope everybody has a great week. Editor Aandark here, and I apologize. I don't know why I kept saying 1930s. The Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, all of that, the Trail of Tears, took place in the 1830s, not the 1930s. The Supreme Court sided with Native Americans about their land being theirs in 1832, not 1932. I don't know why my brain was stuck in 1930 instead of 1830, but I apologize for that.